Good evening, good evening, good evening. Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to WeatherBrains, episode number 783. 783. It's the pre-show, that marvelous time of the program where we do three things. We share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and what else do? We say, occasionally, outrageous things. All right, this is for Monday, the 18th of January, 2021. And if you've watched this before, you know the deal. If you don't want to hear the pre-show, move the slider about 10 minutes in, and that will be the beginning of the show. Most people listen to this show. This started off as just an audio podcast like they all are, but we added video, maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And so a lot of you watch, some watch it live, and we do these Monday nights typically around 9 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock Central Time. But what I'm doing is getting my act together. We're getting the embed code so we can get this thing on television. It is broadcast live in my local market on the digital weather channels. We have the .2s. And they use a certain page for that to happen. So I think we are good there. So now we are going to invite everybody. Hopefully you've had a good week. You know, we're coming up on our 15th anniversary of this shoe here, which is pretty remarkable. 15 years of this. Who'd have thunk it? Weren't sure we were going to last 15 weeks when we started. And really, when we started this show, we didn't ever intend on this to have much of an audience. We needed a creative outlet for those people that do weather in the broadcast world. You live in a very structured world. I mean, you got 2 minutes and 15 seconds and 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and you just don't have time to, let it all hang out. So this was a way of doing that back in 2006. And we've grown the show a lot. We actually have a lot of people that watch and listen. It's almost scary, but it's a great thing. We're like family. So I think we've just invited everybody. So like magic, our guests and regulars will be showing up here in just a second. Yeah, this was the original show from the 31st of January, 06. So we're almost at 15 years. Let's roll it. Here we go. I personally think we have way too many warnings. Severe thunderstorm warnings are a dime a dozen. It's getting to be that way with tornado warning.
Welcome to WeatherBrains, the podcast about weather by weather fans. I'm David Black with the Weather Company from Birmingham, Alabama, welcoming you to our first program. With me tonight, James Spann, the chief meteorologist.
Yeah, that was David Black. David did weather with me on television back in the early 1980s at the NBC channel here. And David is like a professional broadcaster guy. Most of us are not. We just had to learn broadcasting. So David did a great job with the show. And it was 30 minutes. Bill, I'm reminiscing. We're approaching the 15-year anniversary here. So I'm reminiscing of the origins of WeatherBrains. It was a 30-minute show, audio only. And David really produced it. I mean, he had, he pulled the sound bites and put them at the top of the show, and he worked hard on that. And it was a tight little 30-minute weather show back in the beginning in 2006. But it was January 31st of 06. That was the very first show.
Now it's this bloated 2-hour monstrosity.
Yeah, now it's just a bag of rubes, yakking away for 3 hours or something. So Aubrey has a guest.
I do.
And let Aubrey introduce him as the guest panelist, James.
Okay, this is awesome. I mean,
how's our audio with our masks on?
Sounds good.
All right,
you sound good.
Making a good statement there, Aubrey.
Good. I got the snowball.
You just stick a vaccine syringe in your arm, you'd be doing good.
One day soon.
Yeah. We're into the line, huh?
So this is
I actually have been vaccinated.
Oh,
First dose. I'll get the
but you're a
second
healthcare
dose
worker.
on the 9th of February. So, and I did not
Y'all
turn
hired
into a
at the
lizard.
hospital so I can be a healthcare worker too.
the
I
9th
did
is
not
on
turn
a
into a
Tuesday.
lizard, and I didn't. My blood did not turn green, and I did not become a zombie.
But your DNA's been changed. So
DNA's been changed. Yeah. So, yeah, I posted. We debated that, and for those that don't know, if you do weather, if you're a meteorologist, believe it or not, you actually have the skill set to do some other things. And so for 15 years, I have volunteered in healthcare. I've always been interested in healthcare. And I work hard at that job. Doesn't pay a dime, but I'm in the hospital multiple times a week, seeing our employees, the patients, their families. And that's how I got the vaccination when I did. And I posted that, and oh goodness gracious, the hate,
ridiculous,
anger, it was brutal. In fact, I find it followed the next morning. I posted a picture of a cow with frost on the fur, and that invoked hate, anger, rage, and people started fighting and threatening each other. And the sheriff at some point's got to step in here. I'm the sheriff of this deal. And I finally said, just stop it. This has gotten out of hand. If you attack me, if that's fine. You can attack me all day long. I have no feelings left to hurt. You can't hurt me. Attack me, that's fine. But stop threatening each other. And it goes beyond just the, you're a turd kind of thing. It goes into, I know where you live and I'm going to come kill you. I mean, it's just.
It's called the FBI.
The world has changed. And managing these social media, platforms, it's brutal. And,
well, James, you did the right thing. You have to call people out.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it amounts to. That's where we are now, and you call them out, and you don't put up with the BS.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just the sheriff's got to take over here, and I did it as an encouragement to people. That's all that was. It was an encouragement that I got the vaccine. I'm not telling you that you have to do that. I got it. I believe it's safe. I believe it's important. I believe it's effective. And so when it becomes available to you, I would suggest that you try it. I'm not saying you have to, but that's all that was. And
well, where we are on this, James, is that Roger and Stephen and Jennifer and Aubrey and Troy and Bill and James can all say the sun's coming up in the east tomorrow morning with some degree of certainty. Okay, some degree of certainty tomorrow morning. There'll be
it's not. It's south.
Argue the point with us.
Oh boy. Yeah. All right. I'm going to get off my platform here.
I'm not.
Hey,
Before
Roger,
we get on
talk
television.
to us. Hey, Roger, can you hear us? Okay.
I can hear you just fine. I'm enjoying your rant. I love it.
All right, Steve, can you hear us? Okay.
I can hear you just fine, James. Thank you again for the invitation. It's good to see you. Roger, it's actually good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you again, Steve. It's been a long time.
It has been a while, but this is good.
This is great. All right, let me get the thing started because we often get the good stuff in before the show starts here. So let me get the recorders going here. So because this is going to be a good show. So and just so you guys know, we do stream this live on YouTube, but most people listen. So here we go. We're starting the show in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's WeatherBrains episode number 783. This is the weekly show all about weather. This is for the 18th of January, 2021. We are rapidly approaching our 15th anniversary here. And they said the show would never last. Our first show was on the 31st of January, 06. That's how long we've been doing this. Goodness gracious. And Bill, you were in the beginning. You were one of the originals here. We survived.
Bill was in the beginning.
In the beginning.
And in the beginning, yeah, there was Bill, and Bill was with WeatherBrains.
Yeah. No, it's been a great ride. Like I was talking about this in the pre-show. We never really intended on this to be a mass audience show. We just needed a creative outlet. In the weather world, it's so structured. You don't have time to just have an opportunity, have a little fun, have a few laughs, talk about some serious things. And it's just kind of morphed and it survived. And I'm glad that it did. But we've gone from a 30-minute tightly produced show to this 3-hour bunch of knuckleheads that just don't know how to stop talking. Troy,
Thank you.
it is what it is. What it is.
Speaking of knuckleheads who don't know how to stop talking, right, Troy?
He referred to me. So
Yeah. Knucklehead Troy. I don't know. It just kind of rolled into the same sentence there. Troy, how are
believe
you?
me, buddy, Knucklehead Troy is not the least worst thing I've ever been called.
So let's see. Aubrey, you've got a guest, I see.
I do have a guest, and if you may have noticed, I've been absent for the last couple of weeks. We've had a lot of training going on, so I've had my hands tied the last couple of weeks. So I am going to introduce one of my new coworkers, John Stevens. Now, this is his last week on nights with me because he is going to be our new daybreak morning meteorologist. So welcome as we break you into WeatherBrains.
Yes, thanks for having me. This is great.
But one of the reasons I wanted to bring John on tonight is because he had a really interesting story. So way back, a little over a year ago, John came to me, sent me an email and said, I really love weather. I'm a teacher. I really want to consider getting into broadcast meteorology. I'd love to talk to you. And I said, sure, come on in. Let me show you what it's all about. So he expressed an interest in changing careers from teaching, a career that he already had, into broadcast meteorology. So I didn't exactly give him a lot of the upsides because I didn't want him to go back to school, pay all this money to go back to school to make less money. It's just, financially, that's a huge change when you're not in your 20s anymore. And I wanted to make sure he had all the information and it wasn't just glamorous what he thought everything could be. So I gave him really the truth behind everything. He kind of came in and went through my rundown and explained everything of what I did. And somehow he still wanted to get into meteorology. So will you tell everyone kind of the story from there? What program did you choose?
Yeah, so Aubrey directed me to enroll in the weather certificate program at Penn State. So I'm doing about halfway through that program right now. It's a great program. Class starts back up tomorrow, so that'll keep me busy. But yeah, so since then, I remember that night very clearly, and we sat right here, and she gave me all of the downsides first, and I still wanted to do it. So it's a childhood dream of mine. I grew up loving the weather. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in my childhood, we had quite a few impactful events. Probably the most significant was Hurricane Fran back in '96. The center of the storm came right over our house, and I remember that night just hearing the trees in the backyard snapping. I mean, it was just crazy. A few years later, we had a big snow of 2000 and had no school for 2 weeks. So those types of things just kind of impact you. And I would grow up watching Greg Fischel on WRAL every night, and that had a huge impact on me. He actually, for my 8th birthday, had us at the station and let me play on the green screen. I broke his clicker, and so that was fun.
Show title.
Yeah. So that kind of put the bug in me. But then I went to Virginia Tech, and my freshman year was 2005, 2006, and they had no program. And so I wanted to be a Hokie. I wanted to stay there, and so I became a teacher. And the year I graduated, they started the meteorology program. I was like, oh, good, great. But yeah, I taught for 10 years. This was my 10th year teaching, and things snowballed very quickly this fall. I was in touch with Aubrey quite a lot. She and I would email back and forth. COVID prevented me from coming into the station, so we met a few times outside when the weather was nice, but any type of internship would be put on hold because of that. But I decided to take it on myself to practice at home. The good thing about class going virtual for us this year is that I got to practice a lot on Zoom. And so I would do weather forecasts in the morning for my class for like 5 minutes, and it was great. So it was a great chance for me to practice. And then I'd go home in the evening, and Chris Holtzman was the daybreak meteorologist here, and I would tape his broadcast and screenshot every graphic he used, put it on a slideshow and Chromecast it to my projector and practice in front of that. And then I recorded myself a few times. And
so for any students out there who don't have access to an internship, to a green screen, it can be done, because not only did he do that to get practice, but he ended up having the guts to record himself. And that's what he sent in as his reel tape, because he couldn't get access. We couldn't let anyone in the building because of COVID.
So, for the last couple months, I was kept in touch with Aubrey, and she kind of kept me in the loop on what was going on. But, there's this little voice in the back of my head in November that said, I'm going to push for this because I know Chris is leaving and I don't know when this opportunity will come again. So I pushed hard for it. And long story short, although it's been kind of long already, it turned out for my benefit. And my supervisor, Jay, he liked my tape, even though it was in my basement in t-shirt and shorts in front of a screen. It worked out. So here I am. And it's been, as Aubrey put it, Aubrey boot camp. And it has been every bit of that. So it's good. It's good. I'm loving it. It's a great time.
No one would expect anything less.
Aubrey, hope you told John this guy's going to get no sleep for the rest of his life.
Well, this time next week, I will be hopefully asleep because I have to get up at 2:00 in the morning. So it's going to be quite a week ahead. So
what grade did you teach, John?
So I taught for 9 years at the high school level. 9 of them were here locally. And then I taught 1 year. My first year teaching was at a middle school. And that was rough. That was a rough age for me. But high school,
you'll fit right in with us tonight then. Because
you're
kind of middle school
middle schooler.
But my maturity level isn't much higher, which is probably why it didn't work out so well.
Bill will come up with some fart jokes to make him feel right at home. Middle school type stuff. Jen, did you ever work morning? You worked mornings before. You worked a morning shift, haven't you? I mean,
I did. Yeah.
You do radio. I mean, come on. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I worked 3:30 to noon at the Weather Channel was my first shift. So I started that, and then I'm kind of floated. So I've done overnights. I've done it all, and you do not sleep. But now I work around the clock. It feels like when you work from home, you're always on. So
about to say so what is your schedule now? I mean, just like you just don't you don't sleep, do you?
She doesn't even know what day it is right now.
I do not. I'm a little out of it. Well, it's the radio, and then the combination with that with the tornado talk stuff, and we're doing some digital work with the storm report too. So this morning, Ice was in my office at 6:30, and I was rushing to get up here in the studio. So I work all day, and when there's tornado outbreaks, and we're on doing the lives is when it keeps us pretty crazy. And then when we have the winter weather, because I cover around the country, I'm up pretty early because I'm watching stuff, and it's too hard to do it too early when you're watching. Is it going to be freezing rain or sleet? So I'm all over the place. I try to free up blocks of time for myself. So
never a dull moment.
I love it. No, but I love it, and I'm loving the tornado talk. Working with the boys has been great. And Bill, he Zoom bombed us yesterday, or no, it was Saturday. We were doing some Zoom call with Nick and Nelson, and Bill popped on there, and they were so excited to see him. So it was great.
Well, they're awesome. Bill, they're the ones that are great. Yeah, James, let's take it away here.
Yeah, come on, man. We got a big shot. I can't wait to get into this topic tonight. We're going to honor a great legend in our science.
A few weeks ago, James, you'd mentioned that, so we were lucky to get our guest tonight. But Bob Johns, a preeminent severe local storms forecaster researcher, passed away on October 26, 2020, 4 days before his 78th birthday. He'd worked for more than 30 years at the National Weather Service Severe Storms Forecast Center in Kansas City, the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, and we're joined tonight by 2 men who knew him really well and worked alongside him as we come to celebrate his life and work. Our first guest WeatherBrain tonight is a lead forecaster in the operations branch at the Storm Prediction Center. He appeared on show 410 in December 2013. Roger Edwards, welcome back to WeatherBrains. It's been way too long.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Thanks for inviting me back, Bill and James and the whole rest of the crew. I know there's been some turnover in the crew there, but y'all are amazing. I really support what you're doing, and it's great to be back. It's an honor to be back, and it's great to be on with Steve tonight, who, in addition to Bob, was one of my primary mentors early in sales and SPC.
And Roger, I didn't know, and I don't know if we covered this when you were on before, but you worked at the National Hurricane Center.
That's right.
At some point, right?
Yeah, in fact, I was actually working as an undergrad and then as part-time at the Severe Storms Lab here in Norman as a graduate student. And I had to apply to the Federal Registry to get rehired as a graduate student because it was a different kind of appointment. So here I'm a grad student at OU, and out of the blue, Jerry Gerald, who was the deputy director NHC at the time, calls me and says, "How would you like to work at the National Hurricane Center?" And that's that kind of opportunity dropping out of the sky is not something that happens to everybody. And it took me about 22 hours to decide to accept that. And it probably should have taken me less, except I had to sleep. So it was an amazing opportunity to just go straight into operational meteorology at the preeminent place for forecasting hurricanes. And then, that ultimately translated into opportunities to transfer to sales in Kansas City, which in turn led me to meet Bob and Steve. But along the way, I got to know a bunch of terrific tropical forecasters at NHC. I still know them today that are still there, others that are retired. Worked there through Hurricane Andrew, which was just an intense and amazing experience, Category 5 hurricane. It was amazing to be inside the eye wall of that. And to see the aftermath of it in a lot of different ways. And so between that and then working at sales and SPC, I've been pretty blessed.
And is it true, Roger, that some of your children or all of your children are named after hurricanes? Is that a rumor that you can confirm or deny?
My 4 kids are named David, Andrew, Donna, and Camille.
That's outstanding. Outstanding.
My 2 kids have the 4 names. I'm sorry. I need to get that correct because they're probably watching. David, Andrew, and Donna Camille. So
okay. I thought you popped a few more kids there we didn't know about, Roger. That's all right. That's all right. But we're glad you're with us tonight. And thank you for being a part of this. Tonight's second guest, WeatherBrain, retired as the chief of the SPC's Science Support Branch in July 2018 after an amazing 46-year National Weather Service career. He was on show 621 back in December of 2017. Steve Weiss, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Bill, thank you very, very much. James, everybody, I do appreciate the opportunity to be with you tonight. As you mentioned, I've been retired now for, 2.5 years, but interest in weather never goes away. And that's the thing that I think we all recognize. Most of us got interested in weather, as John said, when you were young, very young, and it's what led us to most of our careers. And even after your formal career is over, the interest is still there. It's wonderful with the internet now to be able to pay attention to what's going on, even from my home. So it works out extremely well. I was very blessed to have a lengthy and wonderful career, helped by so many people along the way. And I think those of us who have been able to be active in meteorology and particularly operational type weather, we are among the luckiest people in the world. I do believe that.
I think you're absolutely right. So that's an amazing career, Steve. Kind of step us through it. How you got into weather and how you got in the Weather Service and where you're.
Well, I actually started before it was called the Weather Service. It was the U.S. Weather Bureau. I was an undergraduate. I was very fortunate to work a couple of summers as a student assistant at the old Weather Bureau District Forecast Center in Chicago, which at the time was located on the University of Chicago campus in a 3-story brownstone brick house. That was the Weather Bureau Center that was responsible for forecasting for Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, and all of the Great Lakes. At those 2 summers, it was the summer of '68, summer of '69, that I was there. And it got me got a foot in the door um, for eventual hiring full-time as part of the Weather Service, which came about in 1970 with a reorg. I was able to get hired after I finished graduate school out at UCLA. And the reason I was able to get hired was because of those 2 summers. They considered me to be a continuing employee because there was a hiring freeze on. Now, of course, the only place that I could get hired in Central Region happened to be Detroit, Michigan, which turned out not to be the best place to be from my perspective, but I only spent a year there. From the summer of 73 to the summer of 74. In the summer of 74, I was able to move into sales in Kansas City. And I wound up spending from 1974 into the summer of 2018 in sales and then SPC in a variety of positions, gradually working my way up, but always staying closely involved in operational forecasting and science aspects of that.
So you just missed the super outbreak in 1974, huh?
I was at Detroit when that.
Yeah, had some tornadoes up there that day too, didn't
That's
you?
right. There were tornadoes just across the river in Windsor, Ontario, and I was on the working a day shift that day, and it was way back when communication was by teletype and facsimile, and it was not very speedy. Warnings were very delayed getting transmitted because of the volume that was taking place, and at the time what would be considered limited bandwidth. But I was there for the April 3rd outbreak. And then I was able to get to sales in July of 74. And that's when I first met Bob. In fact, Roger, you may be able to relate to this. I know I did when I worked those 2 summers in the old Chicago district office. I paid a lot of attention to the products coming out of cells at the time, the watches, the outlooks. You start to memorize the names. You don't know who the people are, but to me, they were gods, from heaven who were dealing with severe weather and issuing the watches and the outlooks that covered the whole 48 states.
Steve?
So
you're right. When I was just a kid, I remember weather bulletins scrolling across the screen on the TV stations in Dallas with people like Harold Taft broadcasting them. And they would scroll the text of the tornado watches and I'd see the names at the end. And I remember seeing names like Hales, Johns, Weiss, Anthony. Little did I know then that I would get to work with those guys when I got to sales.
Yeah, it was something that I thought, my gosh, what a wonderful job it could be if you could get there. So when I got back to the Weather Service and was at Detroit, I paid close attention to what was taking place. And the folks at Detroit knew I really wanted to get to Kansas City, and they were actually quite helpful to me. So I knew the forecasters' names, and I was just, couldn't imagine, my gosh, what's it going to be like to go work there with these folks who seemingly with the weather came down from the heavens, in my view, at the time. So when I got to Kansas City, I wasn't scheduled to start until maybe another week, actually, on shift, but I went to visit, and I just to say hello, introduce myself, and I went it was the Federal Building, 601 East 12th Street, room 1728. Roger knows that address extremely well. And I met with Alan Pearson at first, introduced myself. He was the director, spent a little time with him. And then he said, come on, let me take you out to the forecast area and you'll see some of the people. And one of the first persons I met was Bob Johns. He came out from ops. He was working Outlook, day shift. And he had this huge smile on my face. I can still picture it, with his hand outstretched to shake my hand and welcome me and say, "We're so glad you're here. This is a great place to work." And I was kind of like, oh my goodness gracious. I had never seen Bob before. I was very pleasantly surprised. He was relatively young. He was 6 years older than I was. And I was 26, he was 32 at the time. But he was so welcoming and so warm and so glad that I had gotten there. And, part of it was they were short-staffed and they were glad to have somebody coming on board. But he truly just had this aura of love of severe weather. And if you are interested in severe weather the way I'm interested in severe weather, we're going to have a really good time here. And that was my introduction to Bob before I actually had worked a shift at Cells. And, my head was just kind of spinning around. It's like, my goodness, I have reached my dream come true, because that's where I wanted to be. I mean, from the time I was an undergrad, I was thinking, that's what I'd like to get to, but how in the world do you do it? Yeah. So I was extremely fortunate. And
Hey, I've got an amazing little piece of trivia that the audience might be interested in about Steve and Bob. And about Cells and SPC. There are, until Steve retired, 2 people could trace the entire timeline of Cells and SPC from 1952 all the way to the moment Steve retired just a couple of years ago. And that would be either Bernie Mager or Joe Galway, who were lead forecasters from the start, and then Steve. Those 2 by themselves could go through all of SPC and Cells up until just a couple of years ago. And Bob, of course, was in that mix too. And Steve was around a lot longer than Bob was in the end after Bob retired. But it's a remarkable testament to not only continuity, but to the institutional knowledge that we've gained over the years, building on the foundation that has successively been laid through the people like Joe and Bernie, and then in turn Steve and Bob, and then of course now we have people like Rich and me and others there who are trying to continue that and then pass it along to the next generation.
One of the things that I know I felt when I got there is Joe Galway was there. Joe was one of the original Cells forecasters selected in 1952. He came from the Weather Bureau Airport Station at Jacksonville. And one of the interesting things, when they hired the original staff in 1952, they didn't want anybody with severe weather experience. They wanted young forecasters, no preconceived notions, who would just open the horizons to find out what they need to learn in order to forecast tornadoes, particularly at the time. Joe Galway was one of the original forecasters, 1952. He retired in 1984, and he stayed the whole 32 years. When I got there, it was common to say, if you make it to Cells, that's where you're going to spend your whole career, because it's the only place in the country you can do what we do there in terms of forecasting severe for the lower 48 states. Nobody else issues the watches. Nobody else issues the outlooks. If you're interested in severe weather, Roger can attest to this, why would you go someplace else? So it was common to think, if I get here, I'm not going anywhere else. I'm going to stay here for my career. And there were a number of forecasters who did that. And it was considered an honor, a badge of honor almost, that this is what you do. You are a national severe storms forecaster, and you will spend your career there. Roger, you're a testament to that, as far as I can tell. And it was almost like, for me, this was my dream come true. Well, is this all there is now? I'm here. Now what? Now I've only got another 30 or 40 years, but we'll see how it works out. But it was kind of amazing that the amount of longevity within the staff. I think there was a period of time before Jack Hales retired, Roger, that among the lead forecasters, if you accumulated the experience in severe weather at CELS or SPC, it was up well over 200 years of experience just within the 5 lead forecasters. So it's a testament to the organization, the type of work that's done, and the type of people who are attracted to coming there and are fortunate enough to get there.
Oh, that's absolutely right. I consider it living out the dream to be able to work in a place like that where not only is there all this institutional knowledge, but we don't sit around just getting crusty and resting on our laurels. We build on that. We do research. In fact, that's one of the major things that attracted me to this job and keeps my passion going there. And I know it did too for you, Steve, because you did a lot of scientific research as well. But the ability to take theoretical applications and translate those to real life, real time national severe weather forecasting problems, whether it's tornadoes, hail, derechos, and of course, Bob Johns, back to him. His seminal research in derechos with Bill Hurt was absolutely crucial and foundational to much of what we know about that today. And the ability to do that kind of research and to build on those foundations. So it's not just forecasting, it's research and a combination of both. We have dozens and dozens of formal publications published by members of the CELS and SPC staff on our webpage that have been published in journals, and many, many more conference papers piled on top of that. And it's a testament not just to our ability to build on the science and to try to advance the science of severe storms forecasting, but to the passion of the people who work there to be able to continuously advance their knowledge and their understanding of severe storms, and then translate that on into successive generations of forecasters, like say Galway to you to me, and so forth.
No, it was a unique organization in my view. I think a lot of people tuned in, and certainly the folks I'm seeing right here, we don't make improvements in our forecasting unless we conduct applied research to try and solve problems. And Bob Johns was amazingly good at using operational forecast challenges to identify and define research areas that would result in improved forecasting, improved understanding from a scientific perspective, and then applying it to real life weather challenges. And that was, I think, one of the neat things about the operational aspects of CELS and SPC. Every time you deal with severe weather situations, you'll have some unanswered questions and ideas will pop out based on what you're dealing with on the operational desk in terms of areas that can justify additional research. And that's what makes it fun is, okay, this is challenging. We don't understand it as well as we need to. How can we go about improving our knowledge so that not only we can understand the challenges better, but we can serve the public better by then taking that knowledge and issuing improved forecasts. And that, I think, was a really fulfilling approach to the job, that we're not just doing it. Yeah, we're excited about severe weather, but we also realize, and I learned that from Bob, we take this very seriously. we are serving the public, we're serving society to protect life and property, and we have a very serious responsibility, and we have to improve in the services that we are providing.
Stephen and Roger, I hope everyone appreciates. I go back and I mean, Stephen, you're talking about the time when Joe went to cells. We're talking about we're on the period of Fallbush and Miller.
That's right.
At Tinker Air Force Base, and the first tornado forecast that ever came out, and it's just amazing that we have that. But Stephen, I want to tell you something else, and Roger as well, because I love Stephen's story a second ago, and now I'm fixing to throw James Spann and myself in a deep hole here. But let me tell you that, James, you were there. I'm pretty sure of this. The National Weather Service in the 70s and 80s held weathercaster workshops at cells in the federal building in Kansas City. We would go to town. James, I'm pretty sure you were up there for some of those meetings.
I've been there.
We stayed at the Mulebach Hotel in downtown Kansas City. And Stephen, what I find so interesting in what you said is my first trip up there, and I'm pretty sure it was either Alan or I don't know if Fred Osby was on at that point, but I love Fred, a good friend. First time I walked in that building to the 17th floor, this guy as a broadcaster was just amazed. And the first person to come up and say hello to me was Bob Johns. And he reached out, he shook my hand, he welcomed us. There were a bunch of weathercasters. They should have been running for the hills at that point, but they welcomed us, or y'all welcomed us in the building. We continue to do those for so many years, and I'm so lucky to call Bob Johns a close friend. I stayed in touch with him past his retirement and been up to Norman and had seen him in recent years. And it's truly amazing. Stephen and Roger, I still remember the wall of the Service A and Raywark teletypes in the communication area at cells.
You are absolutely right about Bob in that respect. He was an amazingly focused and intense forecaster because he felt that severe weather forecasting was essential if we're going to serve the public well. But he was also one of the most warm, good-hearted people that I've ever met. He never had a bad word to say about people. If he thought it, he didn't say it, certainly out loud. He welcomed everybody who had an interest in weather. And if you had an interest in severe weather, he would be your best friend forever. He felt that it was something that drew us all together, and that by working together, we could solve so many challenges and serve the public that much better. He was amazing in that respect. In some ways, he never lost what I would call his youthful exuberance about weather, and severe weather in particular.
He to me, Stephen, I always saw Bob Johns as the definition, the picture of the word definition of gentleman. He was a gentleman and a great friend. Yeah.
You've nailed him exactly right, Troy. He was a wonderful person, and we are all better off because of the times that we've had with him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I know when I first got to cells, Steve had talked about how we had people who, before they get there, read the discussions. They know the names. They're familiar with the names at the end of the product. Well, it was readily apparent to me long before getting to cells, even as an undergrad and grad student at OU, that two of the most scientifically astute and obviously passionate forecasters, based on the content and quality of their discussions at cells, were Steve and Bob. And when I finally got to sales, I knew I needed to gravitate to those two people, because that was, I mean, I learned from everybody. But as somebody who is really passionate about the science, I knew that if I was really going to maximize my potential to learn about the science and art of severe storms forecasting, then people like Steve and Bob are going to have to be at the forefront of that. And very early in being at Cells, within the first couple of weeks, Bob had organized a sales workshop. I don't know how similar it was to what he did for the broadcasters, like you, Troy, or for others, or James, but it was actually a very well organized, and Bob, if nothing else, he was a pro's pro. He was well organized, and he took it very seriously to be able to forecast storms, analyze the atmosphere, leave no stone unturned. And the case studies and situations he presented in that, and the variety of them, it wasn't just tornado outbreaks, it was derechos, it was null events or relatively quiet events that made it, that made you think, instead of, oh, here's another big windbag. No, not much happened on this day. He would present cases like that as well. And one of the funniest things about that was, in my sales workshop with Bob and several other relatively new young pups, as he called us, to their sales, the first case he presented, oh, I was familiar with that one. I had actually gone over that case before when I was at the Severe Storms Lab, and I remembered it well. The second case he did, well, it turns out it was the 1984 Carolinas outbreak. Well, I was familiar with that one. I'd looked at that one already. And of course, Bob was asking what happened. And I would say, oh yeah, this, and this happened. And I was kind of joking with him. I'd get real specific. I'd say, and you know what? I think there's going to be a tornado that forms here and ends here. And Bob says, you're familiar with this, right? Oh yeah. So we get to about case 4 and case 5, and every one of these things I correctly had guessed. And 1 or 2 of them were actually chase days on the planes that I had chased as well. So that, I mean, he picked cases from around the country, but there were cases that I happened to be familiar with. And I'm just sitting there going, oh man, I'm frustrating this guy to death. He's probably going to hate me forever. And because he was giving us all these cases that we were supposed to learn from, and they just happened to be cases I'd already seen. And so finally he kind of pulled me aside and he said, if you know this date, shh, be quiet. Just don't say anything.
Well, Stephen and Roger, one thing the 2 things that I'll always remember when I met Bob and times after, Stephen and Roger both, I always admired the cigar boxes full of color pencils that you all possessed. And I saw Bob Johns, and more times than a few, with that same cigar box full of color pencils at the workstations there. And then one of the funny things that I always thought, how this shows you how times have changed, but and I think you'll talk about this, Stephen and Roger, in a little bit, but I have a text message on this from Bob a few years ago when he saw his first tornado out east of Norman, because I was checking on him, and he admitted to me then, he said, I think I've seen my first tornado I've ever seen.
Yeah, that was May 10th of 2010. Yep. Ultimately became the Little Axe EF4. Yeah. That buzzed just south of his house. There,
that's right.
West of Thunderbird. And he just watched it from his front yard go racing right past it. Now, he had been on a few storm chases before that with me, but we didn't see any tornadoes. That was his first tornado, and I'm glad he finally got to see one.
And he didn't have to travel he didn't have to travel very far, did he? Just go outside and look. You can see the pencil box there.
Yeah.
And it was a tradition to have, everyone had their own pencils and pens and pencil boxes. There were no sharing of those. The first day I got there on shift, one of the lead forecasters who retired within 6 months after I got there. I hope there was not a cause and effect in that regard. Hilmer Crumrine said in his rural Kansas accent, he said, "Well, we got to get you got to get you a cigar box." And he said, "I've got this supply in the back of used ones, and I'll get you one." And that was in the July of 1974. And I still have that pencil box. It came with me when I retired, and it's here in Connecticut with me now. With the last batch of pencils and pens that I had used at the time. So it was a tradition that everybody had their own pens and pencils. We didn't share them, and it became personalized. Now I'm not sure if you can tell on that one of Bob's. It's taped up around the corners to hold it together, because they will start to come apart. And that was something that oftentimes we had to do. That once you had it, you tried to keep it as long as you could.
You know, one of my favorite memories about Bob and his pencils and pencil boxes. I mean, Bob was an amazing analyst. I learned so much from the maps that he drew. His analyses were not just accurate and detailed; they were works of art, and so were yours, Steve. And these analyses that you guys were doing I would fixate on them every day when I came to work. If I could find one of Bob's maps, I would be paying attention to it, because I knew I could use it for continuity and trust it. But one thing I couldn't trust was that if I left any of my pencils out, they wouldn't end up going into Bob's cigar box there, because he was such an avid analyst that if he found a color or a pencil that he thought he could use that was just laying around loose, he'd sweep it up, put it in a cigar box, and use it. So, and he wasn't trying to steal or anything. He was just, genuinely looking at being able to use them. He didn't want it to go to waste.
Right. There would be oftentimes, but if there was a pencil laying around and nobody was taking it immediately, Bob seemed to think, well, maybe it's mine. And oftentimes folks would go, "I'm missing my green pencil. Bob, do you have it?" And he'd look through his pencil box and somebody would say, "Hey, there it is." And he'd say, "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was mine." There was one time where Bob was very intense when severe weather was quite active. He was laser focused. You couldn't distract him, and he didn't want any distractions on shift. But the pencil box one day, at the end of a very busy shift, he got a little bit confused. And instead of putting his food back in the refrigerator, he put his pencil box in the refrigerator. And everybody joked, well, he issued so many watches on the shift, those pencils needed to cool off anyway. So it was probably a good move to do that.
So many of the pencils, I got into a habit of that I still have today in my pencil box, of taking the pencils and putting the back end in the sharpener and shaving about 1/4 inch off of them. That way I can identify it if it goes missing, because nobody else did that. And so I would go up to Bob and say, "Oh yeah, there's my pencil. It's got the back end shaved off." And,
Talk about the importance of hand analysis still today. Is it still a factor in what you do, Roger, and what you were doing, Stephen, when you retired?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Roger, you're still there. I'll let you talk.
Well, hand analysis it seems passe or old-fashioned because it's time consuming, but the thing is, it's time well spent, because it's time that you get to actually force yourself to slow down and swim in the data and immerse yourself in the state of the atmosphere as it is on the plane you're analyzing at the time you analyzed it. And one of the things that was passed down from not just the operational sales forecasters like Steve and Bob and others, Larry Wilson and others who were there, Jack, who were avid analysts, but even researchers with a strong interest in forecasting like Chuck, who has been a guest on WeatherBrains a couple of times, was you cannot understand what's going to happen unless you understand what is happening. And that is where hand analysis to me has so much value, surface and upper air, because it does force you to slow down and actually conceptualize in 4 dimensions, if you're analyzing multiple time periods, what the atmosphere is up to. The atmosphere is speaking a language through the data, and it is up to us as forecasters to interpret that language and apply it to the concept of the forecast in order to make the forecast the best it can possibly be. And I see an example of that just popped up here. A 500 millibar analysis. It looks like it was from New Year's Day this year, with that complex set of lows in the south central southwest part of the country. You know, even today, models, objective analyses, they're getting better and better all the time. But until we have nearly perfect input observations and input data, we're not going to have perfect model forecasts. And of course, as a lot of us who are in weather know, if you take those minor errors and integrate those out into the future, they get progressively larger and larger. So it's very important to understand the start. Where do we come from? And even where have we been if we're looking at past analyses? And these are concepts that Bob was intensely devoted to on shift. I don't think a shift ever passed that I work with him that he didn't analyze at least one map, if not multiple maps. And that was an important lesson by example, leadership by example, that I've taken with me for the rest of my career.
It was similar with me. One of the things I remember very, very distinctly was within a month of my arrival at Cells in the summer of '74. It was on a Saturday in August, and I happened to be scheduled to work the swing shift, and it was Bob's first lead forecaster shift as a fill-in lead forecaster. And knowing Bob, of course, back then you didn't have the internet. You had no weather information until you came into work, until you teletype machines, fax maps, etc. Well, Bob, of course, came in early, probably 3 o'clock for a 4 o'clock shift. He came into the communications room that you referred to, Troy, with all of the banks of teletype machines. And he started ripping off the different FAA circuits of surface data. And he knew which area he wanted to look for. He knew which circuits to get. He grabbed them off the teletype, hand plotted a regional map, and analyzed it before the computer plotted maps that were available. So by the time I came on shift prior to shift around 20 to 4, he had already analyzed what was taking place and had an idea that we were going to have severe weather on that shift. And as soon as the shift change occurred, within 15 minutes, he then did another map and he said, we need to get a watch out. So I was there when he issued his first severe thunderstorm watch. There were storms developing in north central Kansas. And lo and behold, Roger, it was a northwest flow case, which is something that he studied intently over the next 6 to 7 years, published 2 papers on it. And he issued a watch from Kansas into central and southwest Missouri, and wound up getting 80-mile-an-hour wind gusts back in a time when we didn't get that many reports. It's nothing like today. But Bob had this natural ability to analyze data and formulate the atmospheric structure very, very thoroughly and accurately, and knew what to do. He was amazingly good at being able to even look at the data. He could look at a list of surface obs on teletype And he could picture what the map would look like when that data were plotted. He knew every three-letter identifier under the sun. That's one thing that I learned from him is you got to know these stations. And you got to not just know where they're located, you have to know why they're called what they're called. I mean, it's something simple like Birmingham, James, BHM. Okay, that's sort of phonetic. Mobile, MOB. And that's fine. But then you had other stations like North Platte, Nebraska. And why in the world is North Platte, Nebraska called LBF? Well, Bob knew because he knew the name of the airport. It was Lee Bird Field. You had to know these things in part because we had a manual activity chart. And we had to go through all the obs and plot where there was lightning, plot where there was thunder, and whether there were any wind gusts or hail. And in order to do that in a timely manner, you had to know every station in the country. And Bob knew them in his sleep by the time I got there. And it was like, well, if I'm going to be like Bob, I got to learn all these things. Larry Wilson was the same way. You've got to be able to read the obs. You've got to know what the station is and where it's located. And you can't be spending time looking them up. You've got to commit it to memory.
So, Stephen,
you got to know the raw code of the observations.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask both of you was, okay. And one of your colleagues, Roger and Stephen, John Hart is a good friend there in Norman. And the one thing that John has done is come up with the mesoanalysis, the raw surface pages where you can get the surface maps regionally. And I don't know, I fell in love with John that day when they got that done. And John and I talk pretty often, but has that thing that Bob Johns and all of you did when you had to plot those state surface station models, have computers made us more lazy now?
I think there's certain basic elements that we don't have to know anymore.
Okay.
I think we're missing something if we're not reading the op itself. There's not as much in the way of remarks as there used to be, of course.
Not
but
in the
it's
ASOS
still
age.
Going back to the basic information. Let me backtrack a little bit, Troy. We actually did have computer plotted charts in cells since the late 1960s.
Okay.
It was an very old CDC 3100 digital computer that ran off of punch cards, which people nowadays may say, what in the world is a punch card? Is that something you drink? But we did have charts that would get plotted out. But they would come out about half past the hour, the top of the hour. And many times you'd say, that's too late. I've got the data fully 30 minutes earlier or thereabouts. And if I want to do a regional chart myself, I'm going to do that because I'll get the analysis done before the computer plotted chart even comes out. And that's where Bob was really good at. You had to be careful. Again, you remember what the communications room was like, and you'd go out, down one ramp to the hall, make a right turn up into there. And you had to be careful because if Bob Johns was steaming toward the comms room to get data or to get the old Raywart radar report data at 30, when they have the scan at 35 after the hour, if you were in Bob's way, you'd get shoved aside because nothing was stopping him from getting that data as soon as he could get it to be able to use it.
Well, I think probably the ASOS age kind of changed those OBS from the old SA format, the Surface Airways code, which, which there were so many good comments. If you ever get a chance, I think, oh golly, I'll come back with a name in a second, but there are actually some places where we kept track of some of the best surface airway code remarks ever made by observers along the way, but we lost a little bit of that, if not a lot of it, with ASOS.
Yeah, we have more uniform obs now, but we've lost the human touch, so to speak,
Yeah.
in terms of what is the human observer seeing in a 360 view around the station. And sometimes it's pretty neat, the people have saved copies, I think you have, Troy,
Yeah.
in terms of, tornado southwest moving northeast, abandoning
Station
tower.
evacuated. Yeah.
Yeah,
They-
yeah.
and I think Bill, actually, Tim Vasquez has actually got a list of some of the best manual observation remarks ever made. So I think Tim Vasquez actually keeps up with some of that as well. So
Yeah, that's not a very good day when there's a tornado southwest moving northeast.
Yeah.
That's not a good feeling.
No, but
Unless
back
you're somebody
then-
like me, you're out there watching them and you think, okay, tornado southwest moving northeast. Let me take a couple of photos of it and get the hell out of the way.
Yeah.
it's the old thing, Roger. That tornado's not moving very much, but it seems to be getting bigger.
Yeah.
Back
First
when,
lesson.
back when Bob started, well, when I started, we didn't have lightning detection networks.
Mm.
We didn't know exactly where thunderstorms were. It was a very simplistic approach with radar, an assumption that, well, if the tops were above 25,000, maybe there was lightning occurring. But in most instances, unless we could see the surface observation with remarks of lightning northwest or something like that, we didn't know where there were thunderstorms necessarily. And it was essential to get as much out of the limited data that you had at that time. And Bob was a master at putting that together with just the basic data. What do we have here? How do we interpret it? And how do we put all of this together to come up with a coherent picture of what's taking place in the atmosphere? And if we do this hour after hour, we start to develop continuity, and we have a better idea of not only what has been happening, but what is liable to happen in the short term for severe weather purposes.
Hey, Roger and Steve, they had this thing called RATS at the WFO to see radar. Remember that, Bill? I mean, RATS, Troy. It looked like this black and white smudged up image where somebody just threw up on the page. You couldn't see anything. What was it like? Did you have any better way of seeing radar imagery at cells in the, say, 70s, early 80s?
In the early 70s, no. Early to mid 70s, no. All that we had were the coded radar reports that came out on the hourly radar scan, the teletype scan on the RAWARC circuits, the radar and warning coordination circuits. And we had plotters who would take that data, and that's how they made the old manual radar summary chart for the US.
Yeah.
And they had to get that done by the top of the hour. So they had 25 minutes from the time the radar scan data started coming in. And that's all that we had. We would know an ASRAN, azimuth range from the radar, and they'd say there was a VIP 5 or a VIP 6, and the top was at 56,000. And we go, all right, that's probably the best storm out there. That's where it was 10, 15 minutes ago. And that's the best that we had. It wasn't until the late 70s we started to get in cells some single radar site electronic drops through Cavoris and other private vendors. We could actually see an electronic view of what an individual radar site would look like, but we didn't have any sort of mosaic of compositing. So the interesting thing, in the 1970s, after 1972, when the first geosynchronous GOES type satellite came out, satellite imagery actually provided a better overall view of convective storms than radar did for cells, because we had an overview over a large area, field of view, to see what convective storms would look like on satellite compared to the coded radar report that we got from the individual sites. It wasn't until the late 70s and then really the early 80s when we were able to see radar in its direct form. And particularly after 1980, we got a remote drop off the first Mercatus systems from the University of Wisconsin, the Man-Computer Interactive Data Access System, or Mercatus, where there would be satellite and radar that we could look at. We initially got a remote drop in 1980, and then in 1982, Wisconsin developed, just for SPC, what was called the Centralized Storm Information System, or CSIS. And it was the first time that we had an integrated real-time data set of satellite, radar, and observations that we could look at and try and put everything together. And it was after that that radar again took on its primacy in terms of serving our needs in cells, supplemented by satellite information more. Satellite was very good for the initial development when you start to see towering Q go up before there was radar, reflectivity that would be picked up. But it really wasn't until the late 70s and particularly early 80s that we were able to see actual radar reflectivity images in near real time.
I just think people take this for granted when you could pick up your phone and you've got radar scope. And
tell me
people don't have any idea. I remember, Troy, we had the first digital radar display we had was, I want to say 1979, maybe 78, from Enterprise Electronics in Enterprise, Alabama. And it was dial-up. You had to dial up with a phone and use a modem and connect with the radar site. And I remember one time we had Hurricane Allen coming up on South Texas, and I must have dialed that radar down there probably 3 hours. And I finally got through, and it was just like you've won World War II here with this. It was a different time.
It was very different. When I first got to cells in 1974, the only radar we could actually see was the WSR-57 from Kansas City on top of the old federal building at the time. And that was the only real radar that we could see. So it was limited information, but the thing that was so valuable from my perspective in terms of a learning and training perspective was to make the best of every piece of information you had, because you didn't have that much information to work with. That's why I think hand analysis of observational data was so essential to cells from the beginning in 1952, because you didn't have that much other information. You had to make the most of it. And that's why hand analysis became ingrained into the cell's culture. First, it's because we focused on short term, just the first day. Short-term forecasting for tornadoes, severe thunderstorm watches, and outlooks. But there wasn't much in the way of numerical modeling available. And it was very limited output fields from fax machines. But you had to take the raw observational data and make the most of it, and that is going to provide your conceptual view of what the atmosphere is doing. And if you didn't do hand analysis, you couldn't do your job. And what we found out in cells and then SPC, as more and more data sets came along, we found that they would supplement the hand analysis, but they couldn't replace it in terms of our understanding of atmospheric structure, understanding of processes, and understanding of what changes were taking place hour by hour in terms of quantifying some aspects of the atmosphere. So what started in the 50s and 60s continued through the 70s into the 80s and beyond, even though we were able to get our hands on more and more information as interactive technology developed. but we found that the hand analysis gave us something that nothing else could. And that's why I continued to do it all through my career. Roger's continuing to do it at this time, and other forecasters at SPC, because you can't replace it in terms of how it enhances your understanding.
James, while you were dialing up the radar at Brownsville and Hurricane, and this is coincidental, I just went over and opened one of the 4 file cabinets over here. This is a satellite picture. I was undergraduate at Texas A&M. This is at about 4 p.m. on the 10th of August, 1980.
Oh, wow.
And this was a satellite picture. I'm not sure where I got this from. It could have been from A&M at the time, but this is Hurricane Allen. That is the old. So.
No,
and you know, the other thing I think people don't appreciate now, it's the communication that we have.
Oh yeah.
But most young people have never been in one of these teletype rooms. When I went up there to the 17th floor, Bob Johns I said, can I go back in the communications area? He took me back in that teletype room. Let me tell you what, it was sexy. I mean, that all that clacking going on in there, and bells were going on, and it made I was woozy. It was so good. I didn't want to leave. I mean, it was just too good.
Well, James, that was quick teletype too. Those Raywark circuits moving 65 words a minute. Woo! I mean, they were getting on down. So
you know, it was amazing when people think about that's what we had, and they'll go, I can't believe you got any work done back then. But that was sort of, well, it was at least state of the art in the FAA and the Weather Service at the time. Kansas City was a big communications hub. It was the FAA's weather message switching center during that time. And that's one of the reasons why cells set up in Kansas City in 1954, because of the access to all of this weather data. That it was actually better there than hardly any place else.
And so, Stephen, it wasn't like that Bob or you or Roger or anyone else back in the day, we had these teletypes that you just read what was on the teletype, because up there you had to have paper tapes and say, okay, this watch goes over to this circuit. And you had to take this paper tape and feed it into a feeder and put it on that circuit. That was part of their job up there in communication.
Yeah, there were five different Raywark circuits for different parts of the country. And we had a specific group of communicators whose job it was to run all the circuits, to run the radar scan. It was really neat back then at 35 after the hour. If there was any messages coming across the Raywark, the communicator could break in and say, we have to stop. It's time for the radar scan. And if somebody's message was just 2 lines short of finishing, didn't matter. It got stopped. You were not to go past 35 after the hour. And whoever was sending something would probably go, oh, no, I'm going to have to do it all over again. But it was the central focal of all of this weather data. And the thing that was really frustrating, Troy, is you'd have all these machines running. Well, the ribbon had to be working properly, and it couldn't run out of paper. And if it ran out of paper or the ribbon shredded at the wrong time, you'd lose data that at least seeing it.
Yeah.
The data would still go into the computer room, but we couldn't see it. And that became a problem. So you'd see people scurrying to, oh my gosh, we run out of paper. Quick, get a new roll and put it in there. And
Hey, Bill Murray, this always reminds me of JB's story during the super outbreak in Birmingham. Where
exactly. You got to tell it?
Well, only JB could tell this story, but there was a communicator at the local WFO in Birmingham during the
night of April
1974 super outbreak. And the bottom line, not to make a long story short, he had a mental breakdown. He was standing in the communications room with all of these papers over his head, and he was just screaming at the top of his lungs, holding all these tapes that he was supposed to be feeding, and he just had a breakdown. And Bob Ferry thought he was being electrocuted.
He better hope he was being electrocuted.
Well, one of the stories too, Stephen and Roger, and James, many years ago, not in a severe weather outbreak, I might point out, but we had a person at one of the local WSOs back in the day. I won't say which one, but it was really close to Austin. And he chose to hand type his retirement statement on the weather wire that night. And everyone was trying to break in to send hourly weather and everything else, but he actually finished up and hand typed on the weather wire his retirement statement. He was retiring the next day. So, I mean, it's really amazing. Like Bill said, how communications changed.
Well, I remember.
Here's the one thing about me, the skill set I think a lot of it is developed. I could listen to that sucker. I could listen to the NOAA weather wire. I would know if there was
Ding,
a
ding,
break
ding,
in the
ding,
transmission, and I would know that there was a tornado watch coming or a tornado warning coming. I could hear it before even the bell was ringing. And that went on through the 80s. I don't know how long we had a weather wire, but that was in place for a long time. And that was a skill set that I guess has just gone away. But, you know, every second counts. And if you could listen to that thing and know that something's about to happen and prep the TV guys, get the camera ready, get the lights on, we're about to go on television.
Well,
so
James, there's another one
generation.
real quick for Stephen and Roger. I won't say where this was, but it was close to home too. At the WSO one night, a tornado warning was being issued, and they had a new intern on shift here in Austin. And Dave Owens, he was our MIC at the time. Dave passed away many years ago, but I love Dave. And he's sitting there, and they issue the tornado warning, and Dave all of a sudden turns around and walks out in the operations area. He says, that tornado warning's gone, right? Absolutely. Well, I didn't hear the bells on the teletype. And he said, did you put the 10 bells, which were S's, and 5 Z's was what we saw, James? Did you put that on there? And he says, I put the 10 bells on there. Dave Owens walked over to the teletype, and there it was spelled out, TEN space BELLS. He did not code the S's.
Wow.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite stories.
Oh,
I remember
you know, you think about how much time has passed from, say, the 1970s. I mean, my gosh, it's more than 40 years. Thank goodness we have made tremendous progress in terms of electronic communications these days. But we were pretty backwards, I think, back then when I started. When I got the cells in the summer of 1974, some of the things were being done just as they were done in the 1950s. When I got there, if a watch was going to be issued, there were these multiple carbon paper forms that the lead forecaster would put this form into a non-electric typewriter and type up the portions of states, valid time, explanation, storms are expected to develop, blah, 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 max wind gusts, max tops. They would type it on using a typewriter. They would give one form to the satellite unit, one form would stay in cells, one would go to the communications room where the communicator would cut a tape in order to send the watch out. And that was the same way as it was done in the 1950s. It wasn't until, I think it was either December of 74 or January of 75, where we started issuing watches on what was an electronic terminal that connected a few weather service centers together. But prior to that, it was still done the original way. I feel very fortunate that I was able to start at a time where I actually saw the remnants of the 1950s in cells operations for a short period of time. And then I could gradually participate in some of the advances that were taking place subsequent to that. But it really was it was a very different world.
I
Hey,
remember
Nelson,
in April of 1979, I got to go to the International Science Fair in San Antonio and won the AMS award, which was thrilling to me. But the local, and I don't know what the job was then, but it must have been the equivalent of the WCM then at San Antonio, came and took me to their office because they had one of the first AFOS setups. We did not have it in Birmingham at that point. And that was the highlight of the whole science fair to me, was getting to go look at these blue terminals out at the National Weather Service in San Antonio. And it really wasn't, I mean, it was more of a communications device than a forecasting tool, right? At that point?
It was not quite operational. They declared it operational in 1980, which means it really wasn't ready for prime time, but was already so far past due that they declared it operational. It was a communications tool. You could create products on it, but the word processor was very crude at the time, and in fact, it didn't have an automatic line feed in return. You had to be careful where you were typing and know when to go back down to the next line, or it would just be on top of each other, the characters. It had some ability to display graphics from, say, the LFM model or the old primitive equation models. So you could see some of the graphics. You would have some, it was almost like what you see on the fax machines, except it was electronic, was basically what it was. But it was a step forward because you didn't need teletype tapes anymore. You didn't have to, at most offices, you could get rid of those. And those things were a real bear to utilize. I remember one time when I was first starting as an intern at Detroit, and everything was done by cutting teletype tapes. I remember as an intern, one of the things I had to do was go sit by the lead forecaster. The lead forecaster would type his forecast on a typewriter on paper and then hand to somebody else that, and you'd have to cut a tape. And when I first started out, they said, "Oh, good, you'll learn how to cut teletype tapes." And there was this one instance where this forecaster was running behind and he had to cut his own tapes. It was on a day shift. And they just so happened, it was also the day they had a school children tour come into the Weather Service in Detroit. And it was I think it was late spring, and it was warm, and he had one of those horizontal floor fans that, only rises up a foot or two, and the fan spins around horizontally and blows the air out. Well, it blows the air out of one part. It has to suck in air from another part. So this forecaster is running late. He's typing up, cutting the teletype tapes, and he's yelling at the kids, "Get out of the way, get out of the way, I'm running late." And he grabs this tape and it's trailing behind him. And he's running to get to the communications room, and these children all start laughing. And he looks at them, "What are you laughing at? I'm running late." And they said, "Look," and he looked back, and all he had was about 2 feet of tape, and the rest of it got sucked into the fan.
Oh,
and
boy.
was just shredded to smithereens. And he had no forecast to transmit.
That's another definition of a bad day.
Oh, boy. And he had to go back and cut the tape again and retype the whole thing. So you stayed away from him the rest of the day.
I bet. Roger, I want you to talk about his younger days, his childhood. I know John Lewis did a fantastic article that you're going to use as your pick of the week in a little bit, but it has some journal pictures. He kept notebooks. He did a science project in the 6th grade that never stopped. Talk about his younger days for a minute.
Well, Bob Johns, he always liked to talk about one of his teachers, Mrs. Durr, I think was her name. And John Lewis wrote about it in that article. And even as a kid, and we can all relate to this, who are passionate about weather, there are a number of events that got him to pay close attention to the weather. He was watching the sky from a very early age, and I can certainly relate to that too. And it was a highlight to be able to get up to the top of one of the buildings there in Little Terhune, Indiana, and be able to look out upon the farm landscape, and or to listen to the people come into town and talk about how weather had impacted and affected the things that they had done, both for better and for worse. And growing up in a farm community like Terhune, Bob was very well tuned from an early age to the impacts of weather, good and bad. The rain, I mean, not just severe weather, but the rain, the snow. And then I think the most impactful event for him in his career was when he was an undergrad here at OU, not long after the program was founded in the 1960s. And his sister and others in Indiana, relatives and family and friends, were directly impacted by the Palm Sunday tornado outbreak, 11 April 1965. And so Bob knew of people who were casualties of that event. And that changed his life and changed the direction of his career and really fortified the purpose that he had, the driven purpose to forecast severe storms in order to reduce the number and impact that those events would have in the future, because it directly affected the area where he grew up. And that was something I could certainly relate to as well, having seen a tornado as a kid and having known people who were affected by several different kinds of weather events, where it was giant hail, tornadoes, even the ice storm New Year's Day '79 in Dallas. Very impactful events, and those continued right through Bob's undergrad days. And Palm Sunday was such a huge influence on him, and it really set him on the course that he took into severe storms. And the rest of us are grateful for that, not for what happened on Palm Sunday, but for the impact it had on Bob.
Yeah, it had a great impact. It seared into his memory the impacts. It was during the 1985 Severe Storm Conference in Indianapolis when a number of us from CELS were there. Bob was there, of course. And on one afternoon when some of the presentations didn't look as interesting as on some other days, Bob said, why don't we go up and I'm going to give you a tour of Terhune. It was 35 miles north of Indianapolis. But instead of going the direct route, so he asked me to come along with Bill Hurt, who worked on the derecho study with him, and Brian Smith, who at the time was at the University of Chicago working under Ted Fujita. And Brian came into CELS a few years later. He drove the three of us up, but not as the crow flies. He took us on a tour of tornado damage paths that were still somewhat evident 20 years later after Palm Sunday. It took a couple of hours to go up 35 miles and show us the remnants of some of the downed trees, some of the areas that were affected by tornadoes in that part of Indiana from Palm Sunday. And it was amazing that he knew every seeming square inch of terrain that was affected by the Palm Sunday tornadoes in the area. And he would tell us, a neighbor lived here, a neighbor lived here. There was someone in this family who lived in a house that used to be right there but was destroyed. They were killed and their wife was badly injured. He knew seemingly every detail of that particular event. And it was just amazing for him to give this detailed tour of tornado damage paths 20 years after the event. It was quite amazing. There was one other aspect of that, well, two aspects. One, the reason Bob ran into so many people as a kid is his parents ran the general store in Terhune, and they sold a lot of goods to the local farmers. So he would be there helping in the store, and they would come in and talk about how the crops were doing and how the weather was affecting the crops of particular seasons. Well, this store was still there. However, at this particular time, it was right after they had filmed the movie Hoosiers about the high school basketball team that is little tiny team that wound up winning the single class state championship in the early 50s, I think, in Indiana. And they chose the John's General Store to be in the movie. Mm-hmm. And it was still decorated from the movie, even though they had finished the filming. And it was ironic in a way, because at that point in Bob's life, he was not a big basketball fan, shall we say, Roger. Bob was rather interesting. Like most Hoosiers, he grew up a big fan of Indiana University basketball in the 50s. And they were very good, of course, and they won a championship or two. But then they changed coaches. And the next coach happened to be someone named Robert Knight. And Bobby Knight was not anything like the previous coach who Bob adored, Branch McCracken. And Bob couldn't stand Bobby Knight. And he said, I am swearing off Indiana basketball from now and forever. So they just happened to use the Family General Store as part of a basketball movie, which was ironic in some ways. The other neat thing, and it was very touching to me at least, his mother was still alive. It was very close to Bob's birthday, which is the end of October, and the Severe Storm Conference was in late October. So his mother invited him to come home. She had baked a birthday cake for him. And it was, she welcomed us into the house, and we all had a little birthday party to celebrate Bob's birthday. And I could tell she was so proud of him. It was heartwarming to see the relationship at that point.
So, Steve, is it true that you had Coach Knight send him a retirement note and plaque at his retirement?
Bob was a really good sport about it, and he actually hung it up in his house in Norman. Yes, we were, I don't know, maybe we weren't entirely truthful. We were partially truthful. We sent a note to I don't know if it was Indiana University Athletic Department.
It was Texas Tech.
Or it was Texas Tech. That's right. It was Texas Tech, because Bobby Knight was there at the time, and we might have changed the storyline a little bit. It was true that Bob was a big Indiana basketball fan in his youth, and we were able to get Bobby Knight to send a note to Bob saying, congratulations on your retirement. And I don't remember what else it said, but, I'm very grateful to know that you were a lifelong Indiana Hoosier fan.
Did he send an autograph folding chair with it too, Steve?
No, but we were really, we sent it and we didn't hear anything for a month or two. And we thought, well, we tried, but probably just slipped through the cracks. And it was only 2 days before his retirement dinner, this came in from Texas Tech, and it was signed by Bobby Knight. And Bob accepted it he was surprised, but he was also, as always, very gracious. I think he couldn't believe it, that it was from Bobby Knight. Roger,
I remember in that letter that Bob Knight wrote, and it was a really heartfelt letter that Bob Knight wrote to Bob Johns, thanking him for his service and thanking him for his forecasting all these years. But he said, yeah, I recruited a lot in the Terhune area. We had some great kids come out of there. I'm so glad you were such a big fan of ours.
Yeah. I know a lot of people at the retirement dinner got a big kick out of it. I don't know if Bob was one of them, but he took it as always. Like I said, he was very, very gracious.
Well, I know we're about to run out of time, James. Can I ask one more thing? Do we have time? And
Go,
can we get
go. One
set
more.
up 2nd April 1982, Roger, and then Steve, throw in anything you want to talk about that important day.
Well, of course, that was a really. I was a kid at the time, but I actually was involved in that day in an indirect way, and studied it later when I got to NSSL and later cells. But it was a very intense system with a strong synoptically driven dry line. We had in Dallas, we had very intense dust storm behind the dry line from that. Actually, I could see the supercell to the northeast as it was producing the tornado in Paris. It was an amazing sight. I'll never forget the tremendous structure of that storm looking through the dust behind the dry line. But there were violent tornadoes in Paris, Texas, southeast Oklahoma that day near Broken Bow, and tornadoes continued into the night into Arkansas from a series of supercells and a compact regional outbreak. That day, Bob Johns did something no one else had done before, and it's been done many times since in really serious severe weather scenarios, including April 27th, 2011, among many others. And that was the issue. He issued the very first particularly dangerous situation tornado watch, because his analyses and what he saw unfolding that day gave him the insights to realize this is not just an ordinary day, to the extent there is such a thing. This really is a particularly dangerous situation, and he said so in the text of the watch. And that set the stage and the foundation for the higher echelon or higher tier of severe or tornado watches that we have still today. And of course, Steve, you were working there at the time. You probably got.
I was working there. I wasn't working that particular day. But again, this was 1982. This was before the concept of storm relative environmental helicity had been developed. Bob was using basic sound meteorological principles in order to assess the threat on that day. He was absolutely magnificent in his ability to gauge the threat and what needed to be done ahead of time in order to get the forecast products out sooner so that they could be disseminated. The dissemination was not as fast as it is done, obviously, nowadays. So we had to get lead time on that particular watch and get it out before storms developed. There was a lot more of that back then in terms of pure forecast watch before storms developed. But Bob was a master at that, and everybody knew it. I think even when you came on board, Roger, well before that time, there was an expression that had developed within cells, which said, "Don't mess with Bob Johns' outlooks, and don't mess with his watches. If you change his outlook, you're probably going to regret it." And that was well known within the staff, that if you think you can make an improvement on it, the odds are you're going to be wrong. So
Well, Jack Hales sent me this. He told me this, and I'll relay it to you guys. He said to me, Bob's convective outlooks were the best cells produced and were invaluable to me in getting a handle on the daily challenge of storm forecasting. He was a natural. I was always so grateful to be able to have his expertise to work with. And that's Jack, who had been there longer than a lot of people. And of course, yeah. Jack himself was a seasoned severe weather forecaster after he got to cells, not before, but after.
Yeah. Jack was the longest serving lead forecaster, 36 consecutive years in the position. But Bob was just absolutely amazing. And like Roger said, if you were around Bob at all, you wanted to soak up every bit of advice and information that you could. And quite frankly, Bob became a lead forecaster in 1979. I became a lead in 1984, 5 years later. I was very glad that I could get that position, but I actually had a bit of regret knowing that I wouldn't be working shifts with Bob hardly ever again.
Yeah.
Because he was a lead, I was a lead. We would see each other at shift change. On rare occasions, one of us would drop back to an outlook forecaster position at the same time the other was lead to fill in. But it was something that I regretted in some respects, that I wasn't going to be able to spend a whole shift with him that routinely and continue to learn from him. Because he was just absolutely amazing in his insights and his ability to put the pieces together ahead of time to be able to forecast severe weather the way he did.
Well, I hate to pause this discussion, guys, but we've got to pause for a second because we have a hard out tonight. Before we wrap up, we got to go to Tony Rice, Jen's This Week in Tornado History. We'll do Picks of the Week, the Weather Roundup, and more as WeatherBrains rolls along.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your Astronomy Outlook.
Remember Comet Neowise? It graced our early morning skies last summer. Visible with binoculars, you could just barely make it out with the naked eye if you really knew where to look and were in a sufficiently dark location. Well, we might just have another comet visit our skies by year's end. I don't know about you, but I could use something to look forward to. Still, it's way too early to get excited, and the initial observations indicate that Comet C 2021 A1 Leonard, discovered back on January 3rd, might just be visible from dark locations by December, again with binoculars. Comet Leonard was named for its discoverer, Greg Leonard, and it's still about 440 million miles from Earth, but it's heading our way, and more importantly, it's heading in the general direction of the sun. You see, the closer it gets to the sun, the more energy will excite the surface of the comet, and that causes water ice to boil off and takes dust with it. This is what produces that glowing, fuzzy-looking comma around the body of the comet and a brilliant tail which can grow to hundreds of thousands of miles in length. After more than 100 observations by astronomers worldwide, the orbit of the comet has been calculated. It will be at its closest on December 12th, still a comfortable 21 million miles away, and may be visible low on the western horizon for the next week or two. Let's hope at least. On paper, this indicates a brightness not too far off from what we saw with Neowise, but Leonard's going to be even lower on the horizon, which means we'll be looking through a lot more atmosphere, which reduces the brightness by a factor. Still, there's a lot of time between now and then, and comets are notoriously unpredictable. They could significantly brighten tomorrow or break up completely. Stay tuned for updates. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
This week in tornado history, a long track deadly tornado occurred on January 23rd, 1969. In his book, The Tornado, Nature's Ultimate Windstorm, Thomas Grzoulis notes that the process that brought about using the Fujita scale to rate tornadoes can be traced to this event. This tornado devastated the town of Hazelhurst, Mississippi. It is the deadliest tornado on record in the month of January. The official Storm Prediction Center database has a path length of 117.8 miles. The storm data narrative is extremely detailed, and we break all of that down in our summary at tornadotalk.com. Here are some of the damage details for the Hazelhurst area. Starting near Highway 51 south of town, the tornado completely flattened a quarter to half mile wide area. Almost all the property was destroyed, yet just 100 yards to either side of the destruction, homes and businesses were left untouched. One family of 15 occupied a 4-room frame building atop of a bluff overlooking Lumber Mill Pond. Their home and most of the occupants were blown about 70 yards into the pond, along with other houses and people. In all, 18 persons were dumped into the pond. East of Hazelhurst in the Shady Grove area, the tornado destroyed several homes and buildings before quote-unquote skipping across the Pearl River. There were 11 deaths in Hazelhurst and 140 were injured. In total, 32 people were killed by this tornado and over 240 were injured. On WeatherBrains episode 695, we interviewed Steve Collins. He is a filmmaker and documentarian of the boy with a pop bottle on his head. He tells the tale of a young boy who warned the town of Hazelhurst that a disaster was to happen. He stated this years before the tornado. Those who interacted with him remember that everywhere he went, he had a glass Coca-Cola bottle balanced on the top of his head. It is a fascinating story. Check out episode 695 for the full interview. Do you want to learn to analyze and forecast? Join Tim Vasquez at Forecast Lab, airing most weekdays on YouTube, covering current weather, forecast techniques, and random topics. The address, youtube.com/forecastlab.
So let's do a weather roundup. It's quiet, gentlemen. We have no really major big-time storms. Troy, you're quiet down there, aren't you?
Yeah, looking at the old MMTS in Austin right now, here in Northwest Austin, 64.3 degrees, and expecting rain over the next week. And you know what? Here in Central Texas, we will take it. We've had more drought over the state of Texas. It's been expanding according to the drought monitor. And so we expect anywhere between a half inch of rain over the next 7 days, James.
Roger, how much are you going to get up in Oklahoma?
Well, I'll leave that up to Rick Smith and his folks, but we'll take any amount of rain we can get here too, even though we've had a very moist ground from the recent wet snow event. It's a dry time of year for us climatologically. January is one of our driest months. And so anytime we can get rain this time of year, we'll take it. And it looks like we're going to get a little bit coming up here in the next week or so.
And Steve, where are you now? I don't even know where you're located after you retired.
I am in central Connecticut, James. I moved to a part of the country that I'd never been before, but we moved here to be closer to family, where our oldest daughter and granddaughters live. And we've been here since November of 2018. And we are getting used to cooler summers. Winters that haven't been particularly cold by New England standards at all. And one of the things I thought, James, that, well, I'll leave Oklahoma, Roger, and I won't have to worry about drought anymore. We had drought this summer here. We were at level 2 and level 3. By late August, we were about 12 inches below average on precipitation for the year. And we've had a wet fall. So by the time we got to the end of the year, we were only 5 inches below average for the annual precipitation. So just when you think, okay, I'm leaving the Southern Plains and I don't have to worry about droughts, it followed us here. But yeah, so we're in Connecticut. I don't mind the cooler summer. They think it's hot. Believe it or not, you ready for this? If it hits 90 degrees, they call it a heat wave. And that doesn't seem too bad to us, because my gosh,
that's nothing for us down here. Wow. All right. Well, we got a hard out here. So, Bill Murray, we got rain down here in the deep south coming up later this week, but no winter storms or floods or anything like that. So let me roll Jen here and we'll come back with picks of the week.
Do you want to learn to analyze and forecast? Join Tim Vasquez at Forecast Lab, airing most weekdays on YouTube, covering current weather, forecast techniques, and random topics. The address, youtube.com/forecastlab.
All right, guys. Picks of the week. Troy, give us something good.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that following the radar, National Weather Service national problems with the national radar, that there's still some good sites. Now, actually, there's been some stuff written on this, but I want to point out the Aviation Weather Center. They still have a nice radar site nationally and regionally as well. If you want to go to a less intense site, I recommend that. Cliff Mass did a good story, blog entry on the 1st of January, James, on the national radar issue, and that's my pick of the week.
Awesome. All right, Bill Murray, go. I'm trying to stall for Roger and Steve so they can come up with something. Go, Bill.
Yeah, well, Roger's probably okay, but Steve probably needs a little stalling time because I didn't tell him. But breaking news, James, February 1st, Louis.
Hang on.
We interrupt this program for a CBS Radio Net Alert Bulletin.
You'll get to go over all this stuff with the big guy on February the 1st. Louis Uccellini will join us for WeatherBrains on that night. So that's really good. My pick of the week is the final in my series. I've cleaned off my entire bookshelf of Tim Vasquez books, And this is the purple one, the Weather Analysis and Forecasting Handbook, which is just a plethora of great forecasting details, especially for a young forecaster. I think you'll find it very useful.
Awesome. All right, Roger, what you got? Give us a pick of the week.
All right, my pick of the week are two papers on EJSSM, Electronic Journal of Severe Storms Meteorology, ejssm.org. If you go to that site and you look up bibliography, you will find two papers related to Bob Johns. One is a biography by Lewis. John Lewis wrote a great biography on Bob Johns. It's listed there in the bibliography on EJSSM. Folks who watch this program who are interested in learning more about Bob's life, especially his early life, go check it out. It's a really wonderful biography. And the other is Bob's extremely detailed work that he on a team that he led with Chuck Doswell and John Hart and Steve Piltz and Matt Gilmore, and Don Burgess was his next author, on documenting in detail the path of the 1925 tri-state tornado. It was an extremely large project. A lot of years of work went into this, and it's a really, really wonderful case of forensic meteorology. So check it out, Johns et al. And Lewis.
Awesome. And those are Hall of Famers right there. That's incredible work. All right, Steve, so we've stalled here. This can be a website, hardware, software, book, anything, anything weather.
I'm going to focus on Bob as well. Bob is probably best known for his work on derechos and bow echoes. But before he did that, he did two papers, 82 and 84, on northwest flow severe outbreaks. And that was almost revolutionary in terms of his research on severe weather episodes that occurred west of the primary upper trough, when you normally expect there to be subsidence. He had, like I said, the first watch he ever issued was under northwest flow aloft. It caught his attention because there was really no work done on that before. There was an in-house study that Joe Galway had done that was so old it was in mimeograph form, if anybody remembers what that was. But there hadn't been any type of systematic study of northwest flow, and Bob went into it with his usual vigor and intensity to do a 2-volume set of papers. I think they were in Monthly Weather Review on severe weather occurrence under northwest flow aloft, part 1 and part 2. And if you take a look at it, you will all of a sudden realize, I think, my gosh, why didn't we recognize this before? It's always when somebody does very good seminal work that comes across very clearly, we scratch our heads and go, why didn't we notice this previously? So I think it was very representative of what Bob did. He was a bulldog. When something caught his attention, he dug into it very, very thoroughly and was able to discern some very fundamental understandings that I know helped me a great deal in terms of my outlooks and watches because of his work on that.
And I think all of us in the weather enterprise benefit from the work that Bob did. But this has been a great discussion, Jen. We could talk all night here. I mean, we got to get these guys back, Bill. But Bill, you want to promote the next few shows here while we're on the way out?
Yeah, we've got a tentative date next week for Rebecca Morse and Julie DeMuth are going to join us to talk about the perceived tornado likelihood in the southeast. And then, of course, Louis on the 1st, and then Ken Graham on the 22nd, and Neil Jacobs on March 1st. So we've got a busy 6 weeks coming up here on WeatherBrains.
Awesome. So if you want to watch live, we're typically on every Monday night at 8 o'clock Central, 9 o'clock Eastern, live.bigbrainsmedia.com. Most of you listen. We know that. If you want to get in touch with us, the email address, it is email@weatherbrains.com. Jen had to leave a little early. Aubrey had to leave early. We'll promise we'll do email next week. So on behalf of the entire WeatherBrains crew, I'm James Spann. Thanks for listening. Have a great week and God bless. This was
Thank you, Steve,
great
Roger.
show.
Roger and Stephen, how amazing.
Great show. Thanks to both of you. This was awesome.
Well, I appreciate Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
I say thanks, James, for having us on. It's hard to follow an amazing act like Tom Skilling. I watched last week's show.
Yeah.
It was
He was good.
really
This was just as good.